The Premier League is the biggest and richest league in world football, and it isn't even close. Premier League revenue, at €6.5 billion a season and rising, is now worth more than the next most lucrative leagues in world football, La Liga, and the Bundesliga combined. Premier League clubs now spend a collective €4.3 billion a season on wages, compared to €2.4 billion in La Liga, €2 billion in Serie A, and €1.9 billion in the Bundesliga. In terms of gross transfer spend, Premier League clubs spent a collective €3.1 billion last season, compared to just €882 million in Serie A, €704 million in Ligue 1, and around €550 million in La Liga and the Bundesliga. So more than the other four leagues combined. The gulf is even wider when it comes to net spend, with the rest of Europe, except for a small handful of clubs, now reliant upon sales to Premier League teams just to fund their own signings and day-to-day operations. We now live in a world in which Bournemouth, in a rickety old 11,000-seater stadium, can take players from AS Roma, Newcastle United can poach players from AC Milan, albeit they might end up getting suspended for the next 10 months, and Aston Villa can casually pluck the best players from the likes of Villarreal, Sevilla, and Bayer Leverkusen. In the 2024 Deloitte Football Money League, which ranks clubs based upon how much annual revenue they generate, there are 6 English clubs among the world's 10 richest teams, and 14 amongst the top 30. Leeds United, who are currently in the Championship no less, rank above French giants Lyon and only very narrowly behind last season's Europa League winners Sevilla. The financial imbalance that exists within European football, which is one of the main reasons why some European giants were, and indeed still are, so keen on the idea of some kind of European Super League, is absolutely enormous. So much so that, as I recently made the case on this very channel, it could be argued that the Premier League already is a de facto Super League, just with all of the clubs playing their games in England, for now at least. The Premier League has been the biggest and richest league in the world for more than 20 years now, and the gap between it and every other league only grows larger and larger with every passing season. And yet, since 2000, English clubs have won just 6 out of a possible 24 Champions League titles, and a mere 4 Europa Leagues, losing every single final in which they have come up against a Spanish opponent for more than 20 years. This season, half of England's 4 Champions League representatives, Manchester United and Newcastle United, not only failed to progress from the group stage, they finished bottom of their groups, failing to even drop down into the Europa League. Meanwhile, Arsenal just lost the first leg of their round of 16 tie against Porto, whose revenue is lower than that of the team that finishes bottom of the Premier League each season. It's for that reason that I was recently asked, in various different verbiage, by 4 separate people both online and in real life, very occasionally I will talk to people not on the internet, why English clubs aren't more dominant in Europe. Surely, it was put to me, given the financial might of the Premier League, the league's teams shouldn't just do well in Europe, as they do, winning the odd trophy here and there. They ought to be a relentless winning machine, annihilating all those who dare to step in their wake, en route to an all-English semi-final stage. Well, I'm not one to shirk a challenge. So long as that challenge is a football-based query that I can monetize for content and call a job, and doesn't actually require any physical bravery or even the possibility of any personal sacrifice whatsoever. So today, I'm going to try and answer that question. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to England, the home of lollipop ladies, 99 flake ice creams, and a deep-rooted hatred of young people, and a burning desire to see their lives made ever worse, as we take a look at why English football clubs, despite seemingly having every financial advantage imaginable, aren't all conquering juggernauts in Europe. When discussing the success of English clubs in Europe, or lack thereof, the past and present can often be conflated. You might even have noticed that I did it in the introduction. I mentioned Manchester United and Newcastle finishing bottom of their groups this season, alongside English clubs only having won the Champions League 6 times in the 21st century, spanning 24 editions of the competition. It is a clever sleight of hand, if I do say so myself, to create a neat and tidy narrative about English clubs in Europe, but the reality is that the reason why Newcastle failed to reach the knockout stage of this season's Champions League, and English clubs have won so many fewer Champions Leagues than, say, Spanish clubs over the last 35 years, are, at best, only tenuously related. When Manchester United won the treble in 1999, beating Bayern Munich by virtue of scoring 2 goals in injury time, they became the first English club to be crowned as European champions in 15 years. But there was good reason for that. Following the Heysel Stadium disaster at the 1985 European Cup final, which Liverpool lost 1-0 against Juventus, English clubs were banned indefinitely from all European competitions by UEFA. The ban was lifted in the 1990-91 season, after 5 years, for all English clubs except from Liverpool, who were only allowed to return the season after that. Prior to the ban, which came as the result of 39 people being killed, more than 600 injured, and 14 Liverpool fans being convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 6 years behind bars, it would be a grave understatement to describe English clubs as merely being dominant in Europe. In the European Cup at least, English clubs were virtually hegemonic. Between 1975 and the UEFA ban in 1985, out of 11 European Cup finals, 9 featured an English club. Every single final between 1977 and 1982 featured an English club. English clubs won 6 European Cups on the bounce, and after Hamburg's success in 1983, normal service was resumed. As Liverpool were crowned as European champions in 1984 against Roma, 1 year before their final against Juventus, that led to English clubs being banned. Bearing in mind that, throughout this period, only one club from each country, namely the previous season's domestic champions, qualified for the European Cup, and it was a straight knockout format with no group stage, so just one slip-up and you were out, the consistency of English clubs for more than a decade was pretty much without precedent, with the exception perhaps of Real Madrid's early dominance of the competition when they won 5 straight crowns under slightly different circumstances. The UEFA ban changed everything. Not only, in the most fundamental sense of course, did it prevent English clubs from winning any European competitions for the next 5 years, by virtue of not being able to play in them, it isolated English football from the rest of the continent. Whereas at the 1982 World Cup, only one member of the England squad played their club football outside of England, namely backup striker Tony Woodcock, who played for Cologne, and even he joined Arsenal later that very same summer. After English clubs were banned from European competitions, even as famously poor travellers, some of England's best players left the First Division. The likes of Mark Haitley, Ray Wilkins, and David Platt all joined teams in Serie A, as did Paul Gascoigne and Des Walker a little bit later on. Glenn Hoddle tried to better himself by joining Monaco, Gary Lineker couldn't turn down the opportunity to play for Barcelona, and Chris Waddle signed for Marseille. Even more common, as in the case of Gary Stevens, Terry Butcher, and Trevor Steven, was English players heading north of the border and joining Scottish clubs, who were still able to compete in Europe throughout this period. At Italia 90, in fact, when England made it through to the semi-finals of the World Cup, there were more Rangers players in Bobby Robson's squad than there were players who represented any other single club. More important than the sheer capital flight, in terms of losing talent to the rest of Europe, and arguably more important than just not being able to compete in Europe for 5 years, was the tactical, technical, and professional isolation of English clubs. This was a period of rapid innovation in football. The same year that English clubs were exiled from European competition, Johan Cruyff took the reins as the manager of his former club Ajax. In 1987, Ajax won the European Cup Winners' Cup with an all-Dutch starting 11, which featured the likes of Frank Rijkaard, Marco van Basten, and a young Dennis Bergkamp, honed on the principles of total football and in playing the game, how Cruyff felt that it should be played. In 1988, Cruyff was appointed as the new head coach at Barcelona, where his impact would be even more consequential. In his first season at Barcelona, with Gary Lineker playing on the right wing, Cruyff won the European Cup Winners' Cup once again. And in 1992, by which stage he had overhauled the Barcelona team, Cruyff won the treble. A 1-0 win against Sampdoria in the European Cup final, providing a vindication of his tactical revolution, along with successive La Liga titles. A Barcelona team which featured the likes of Pep Guardiola, Michael Laudrup and Hristo Stoichkov, later to be joined by Romario, came to be known as Cruyff's Dream Team. Cruyff appended Barcelona, implementing root and branch reforms in the immediate aftermath of the infamous Hesperia mutiny and reshaping the club in his own image. It wasn't just the first team. Cruyff was obsessed with La Masia, Barcelona's youth ranks, mandating that they play and train in the same way as the first team, so they were tactically and technically equipped to play the way that he wanted them to, and could seamlessly step up to the first team at any moment without being expected to do anything different. Cruyff is just one example. At the same time, former shoe salesman Arrigo Sacchi was implementing an equally radical set of new ideas at AC Milan with even greater success. Sven-Göran Eriksson worked wonders in Italy and Portugal while belonging to an entirely different school of thought, and there were just as interesting innovations and ideas coming to the fore in Eastern Europe, as both Steaua Bucharest and Red Star Belgrade upset Western Europe's elite to be crowned as European champions. As important as any tactical innovations was the modernisation of training, diet and nutrition. While all of this was going on, a footballing earthquake of sorts, English clubs and English football watched on from the sidelines, semi-aware of what was going on, though much less so than they would have been nowadays, when the world is so much smaller and everything is broadcast in ultra-high definition, but always 1 or 2 degrees removed. Whereas Barca's dream team, AC Milan's revolutionary offside trap, and Staua's unbreakable defensive shape and discipline within a 4-2-2-2 formation presented a fresh challenge to the rest of Europe, and one which had to be overcome if they wanted to win anything. English football, sort of inevitably when you think about it, became very insular. It was no use Arsenal contemplating how they might best break down Sven's Benfica or match the energy and professionalism of Latex Bayern, where all that they needed to do was overcome Middlesbrough and Luton Town in order to be crowned as First Division champions. It's not that English football terminally declined during 5 years outside of Europe. The national team's fortunes actually improved. They were just left behind and out of the loop when it came to ways in which to succeed in Europe. Despite being so dominant then, to an unprecedented and almost tediously predictable extent before the ban, English clubs wouldn't just waltz back into Europe and win again. Not until Manchester United beat Bayern Munich in injury time in Barcelona in 1999, 14 years after Heysel and 9 years after English clubs had been readmitted to Europe, did an English club even reach the final of either the European Cup or the Champions League, as it later became known. Though English clubs were readmitted in the 1990-91 season, by virtue of Liverpool winning the league the previous season and being banned for an additional season, there was no English club in the 1990-91 edition of the competition, meaning that English clubs were de facto banned from Europe's Premier competition for 6 years instead of 5. The first English club to compete in the European Cup post-ban in the 1991-92 season was Arsenal, who lost 4-2 over 2 legs against Benfica in the second round. Over the next 4 seasons, Leeds United and Manchester United were knocked out by Rangers and Galatasaray also in the second round, before a change of Champions League format, which saw both Manchester United and Blackburn Rovers dumped out in the group stage instead. To say that English clubs underwhelmed in Europe following their return, again, would be a pretty gross understatement. It wasn't until Manchester United reached the semi-finals in 1997, where they lost 2-0 against eventual winners Borussia Dortmund, that some pride was restored. Even after the Red Devils won the Champions League in 1999, the first English club to do so since Liverpool in 1984, it didn't exactly mark a turning point. The next 5 finals didn't feature a single English club. The 2002-03 season provided particular disappointment, as Liverpool were knocked out in the first group stage, finishing below Valencia and Basel. Newcastle and Arsenal were seen off in the second group stage, and Manchester United went out in the quarter-finals. It meant that only 1 English team reached the quarter-finals, compared to 3 each from Italy and Spain, and none made it through to the semis, which was an all-Italian and Spanish affair. That is vital context in understanding why, between the mid-1980s and the mid-2000s, English clubs performed so poorly in Europe, or indeed, didn't perform at all. It is less relevant, though not entirely irrelevant, to understanding why Liverpool lost the 2022 Champions League final against Real Madrid, Newcastle and Man United went out in this season's group stage, and Arsenal, despite putting between 4 to 6 goals past every Premier League team that they face at the moment, just lost 1-0 against Porto without registering a single shot on target. It's not entirely irrelevant because there are still tactical differences between Premier League teams and those on the continent, and indeed, between different teams on the continent themselves. Chiefly, the Premier League is still played at a faster pace and with more physicality than most of Europe's biggest leagues. Tactically and professionally, the league has changed an enormous amount since the beginning of the 1990s, the breakaway of the Premier League from the rest of the Football League, and the European Cup becoming the Champions League. Arsene Wenger was the catalyst for a lot of that change after he was appointed by Arsenal in 1996, particularly in terms of the diet and nutrition. The drinking culture in English football was still enormous when Wenger arrived, something that was alien to players throughout the rest of Europe, and Wenger set about changing it at Arsenal. As soon as the results of those reforms became evident and made such a huge difference for Arsenal, everyone else had to follow suit or get left behind. In Wenger's first full season in charge of Arsenal, the Gunners won a Premier League and FA Cup double, and for the next 8 seasons, they never finished lower than second. The results, therefore, were fairly emphatic, and it didn't take long for the rest of the league to catch up. Now the diet, nutrition, training, conditioning, and sports science are as good in England as they are anywhere else in the world, if not marginally superior, given the resources at the disposal of Premier League clubs. At the academy level, likewise, English clubs, professional or otherwise, have come on leaps and bounds even just over the last decade, in terms of introducing small-sided games, small goals, 1, 2 or 3 touch matches, and just generally putting a much greater emphasis on technical ability and honing a player's skills, rather than just who is the quickest, strongest, and most likely to win you a game before they're even fully developed. English teams are, nonetheless, often less patient in possession than their European counterparts. Manchester City, the reigning European champions, are an obvious exception to this, but if you look at either Newcastle or Manchester United in the Champions League group stage this season, both sides struggled to dominate possession and control games. Even in their most impressive Champions League performance and result, a 4-1 win at home against PSG, Newcastle only kept 26% possession. That is less than Luton Town kept against Man City in the Premier League this season, as was the 27% that Newcastle had in their 1-1 draw away in Paris. The situation was, if anything, even worse for Manchester United, despite having far more recent pedigree and experience than Newcastle in Europe, who only kept more than 50% possession at home against Copenhagen and Galatasaray out of their 6 group games, and even then, they barely did, with 51 and 55% possession. Away at Galatasaray, United only saw 42% of the ball, and in both games against Bayern, they never got above 40%. It's a similar problem that we have seen at times with the England national team, particularly at major tournaments where the games come thick and fast and the conditions can be hot and humid, where they begin to lose the midfield battle during the knockout stage. Speaking of games coming thick and fast, it is hard to imagine that the intensity of the Premier League, the number of games in English football, and the strength of the league as a whole doesn't hurt English teams that compete in Europe. I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this video some of the financial disparities between the Premier League and Europe's other leagues, which one might imagine would lead to English clubs hoovering up the continent's biggest prizes on a routine basis. That's not an entirely unreasonable assumption, but the real disparity, when it comes to the Premier League compared to every other league, isn't so much in terms of the rich 6 or 7, though they do have definite advantages, but in terms of the rest. Let me explain what I mean. For all of the woe is me talk of Real Madrid president Florentino Perez and the murmurs of discontent among him and his acolytes about the Premier League's revenue and revenue growth far outstripping Europe's other leagues, the reality is that Real Madrid can still compete financially with any other team in world football. For now at least. Los Blancos took Thibaut Courtois, Antonio Rudiger, and Eden Hazard from Chelsea, one of the Premier League's rich six, and they routinely beat Chelsea and other rich six clubs to widely identified transfer targets like Vinicius Jr., Eduardo Camavinga, Aurelien Tchouameni, Jude Bellingham, and likely soon Kylian Mbappe, that almost all clubs are or would be desperate to sign. Consequently, the Real Madrid wage bill is higher than that of any team in the Premier League, as is PSG's, which has been the highest in Europe for the last few years. Meanwhile, Barcelona and Bayern Munich's wage bills are higher than either Arsenal or Tottenham's, and Inter Milan, Juventus and Atletico Madrid all maintain wage bills significantly higher than Newcastle's. Again, for now at least. This graph by the excellent Swiss Ramble, who I hope won't mind me borrowing it since I have included his watermark, I pay for his Substack, and I would recommend subscribing to it also for anyone who is interested in football finance, is a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. The graph illustrates the distribution of wages in each of Europe's Big Five leagues, from the top to the bottom clubs. As you can see, at the top, both Liga 1 and La Liga are ahead of the Premier League, and neither Serie A nor the Bundesliga are all that far behind. As soon as you go past the first 2, 3, or in Ligue 1's case at least, one team, the drop-off is startling. The wages at the third highest spending team in Ligue 1 is already lower than that of all but the bottom 3 in the Premier League. A mid-table club in England's top flight pays their players at least twice as much as a mid-table club in any other league. It is probably for this reason that we see English teams performing especially well in recent editions of the Europa League and the UEFA Conference League, since the disparities there between Premier League clubs and their competition is far greater than it is between Premier League clubs and Europe's uber elite in the Champions League. West Ham, for example, who won the Conference League last season, have a higher wage bill than European regulars like the Europa League winners Sevilla and current Bundesliga league leaders Bayer Leverkusen, and almost exactly twice the size of their actual Conference League final opponents Fiorentina. Brighton and Liverpool, both of whom topped their groups in the Europa League this season, along with West Ham, have the biggest budget in the competition by far in Liverpool's case, and among the biggest in West Ham and even Brighton's, despite the latter being viewed as plucky underdogs and such savvy operators in England, which they are. Though Brighton have a bottom half wage bill in the Premier League, emphasising just how well they did to finish 6th last season and to currently sit in 7th, their wage bill is actually the same size as the second highest spending club in France, namely their Europa League group stage opponents Marseille, and higher than the likes of Villarreal, Eintracht Frankfurt, and even last season's Serie A title winners Napoli. Aston Villa, England's sole representative in this season's Conference League, keeping the claret and blue flame firmly alive, may be punching above their weight to be 4th in the Premier League this season, but in the Conference League, they are in a world of their own. Only Eintracht Frankfurt and the two Turkish giants have budgets which can compete with theirs, and most Conference League teams have wage bills that would look low in the Championship, the second tier of English football, let alone in the Premier League. Maybe the best illustration of the disparity distribution is a comparison between the team that sits 10th, so exactly mid-table, in each of Europe's top 5 leagues. La Liga's 10th place team Getafe have a £42 million wage bill, the Bundesliga's 10th place team Hoffenheim's is £74 million, the team in 10th in Serie A is Torino, whose wage bill is £65 million, in Ligue 1 it's Lyon, who actually have the league's 4th highest wage bill at £84 million, but in the Premier League, the team in 10th is Chelsea, whose wage bill is £340 million, which is far more than the other 4 clubs all combined, and ranks joint 7th among the biggest wage bills in Europe, tied with Barcelona. Over the last 2 seasons, Chelsea are, quite literally, the highest spending football team of all time over that period of time, even when adjusted for football-specific inflation. That prompts the question, why haven't English clubs historically dominated the Europa League, having had this financial advantage, albeit not quite to the same extent, for much of the past 2 decades? To which, the answer, in large part, however unsatisfying it might sound, is just that, for a very long time, English clubs didn't have the same interest in the Europa League, and particularly the UEFA Cup, as it was previously known, as clubs from pretty much everywhere else in Europe. Before foreign coaches with a better feel and affinity for the competition came into the Premier League, and particularly before winning the Conference League and the Europa League came with qualification for the Europa League and the Champions League the following year, the Europa League or UEFA Cup was just viewed as more of an inconvenience by whichever of the rich six teams happened to drop into it after failing to qualify for the Champions League. Whereas a lot of European teams would rest players in domestic fixtures to keep them fresh for a UEFA Cup tie, Liverpool or Spurs might do the precise opposite, resting players in Europe ahead of a Premier League fixture. The Europa League and Conference League are major cash cows for many European clubs, but for Premier League teams, it is a drop in the ocean. My own club, Hull City, after we qualified for the Europa League, unforgivably in my opinion, rested players for a trip to Lochran because we were playing Stoke City in the Premier League at the weekend, and ended up getting knocked out of Europe for the sake, supposedly, of drawing 1-1 at home against Stoke. For fans, the idea of sacrificing a once-in-a-lifetime run in Europe, particularly for a club like little old Hull City, for the sake of 1 point in the battle for survival, is a travesty. But for the club, it was just a straightforward business decision. Even going deep in the Europa League wouldn't make up for a fraction of the revenue lost with Premier League relegation. Naturally, of course, we ended up getting knocked out of the Europa League early and getting relegated that season, so it was really the worst of all worlds. I mean, we might as well have had a go in Europe after all. Now that the attitude towards the Europa League has changed though, 4 out of the last 8 Europa League finals have featured an English club, including an all-English final between Chelsea and Arsenal in 2019, and the 3 English clubs in the competition this season all feature among the 5 favourites to win the whole thing. Likewise, I would be personally surprised if English clubs didn't routinely start to make the Conference League final and win the competition, following in West Ham's footsteps. At this point, it is probably worth addressing the elephant in the room, which is that although I had numerous requests to make a video about why English clubs aren't more dominant in Europe, English clubs historically not having been dominant in Europe, and English clubs certainly not having been dominant in the Champions League so far this season, in some ways, and this might seem like an odd thing to say in this of all videos, English clubs are actually quite dominant in Europe. Only 6 wins out of the last 24 Champions Leagues is one way of putting it, but half of those 6 wins have come in the last 5 years, and 3 out of 5 paints a rather different picture to 6 out of 24. England ranks first in UEFA's league coefficient rankings, which is based solely on the performance of each country's clubs in Europe, and by a distance. There have been 5 English finalists in the last 8 Europa Leagues, the reigning Conference League champions are English, and the last 6 Champions League finals have featured 7 English clubs. Spain is the only other country to have had multiple finalists, but by multiple, I mean 2, compared to England's 7, and they were both the same team, Real Madrid, whereas England has had 4 different finalists in the last 5 years alone. You could make the case that English clubs could still be more dominant, and there is no doubt that they have an abysmal record against foreign, and especially Spanish opposition in finals, but overall, it's not bad going, is it? There are lots of reasons why English clubs may face additional hurdles in Europe. Aside from all those that I've already mentioned, the point that I was trying to make earlier about the speed, intensity, and relentlessness of the Premier League before getting sidetracked blindly by wage comparisons was that Premier League teams very rarely get to take their foot off the gas. Because the elite in Europe's other major leagues have budgets in line or sometimes even greater than the big 6 teams in the Premier League, while the rest of those leagues have budgets lower than top half championship teams, it's much easier for the likes of Real Madrid, Bayern Munich and PSG, in a typical season at least, to rest and rotate players, or at least for those players to avoid burnout by coasting and relaxing in games where they have significant control and dominance. Far more so than it is for Premier League teams. Combine that with the lack of a proper winter break, and the fact that England has not one, like most other countries, but 2 domestic cup competitions, the FA Cup and the EFL Cup, making for an even more compact and demanding schedule at times, and it's not hard to see why, particularly in the latter stages of a season, Premier League clubs could be at a disadvantage. Pep Guardiola's great Barcelona team, for example, when they won the Champions League in 2009, they had such a comfortable margin at the top of the La Liga table that they were able to rest and rotate all of their big hitters, failing to win any of their final 4 league games in fact, even losing against minnows like Mallorca and Osasuna, in order to be at maximum capacity for the Champions League semi-final and final ties against Chelsea and Manchester United. Chelsea and Manchester United, by contrast, were still going hell for leather in the league at the time and couldn't afford to take any games lightly, with the exception of Man United's very last game of the year that season, because the title had already been wrapped up. What's more, much as it shouldn't, because it is just 11 players against 11 players, rather than the badge on the shirt or trophies in the museum, European pedigree really seems to matter in competitions like the Champions League and Europa League. When you look at the sense of belief that Real Madrid or Sevilla always possess in those respective competitions. Make no mistake, I think that this is a secondary consideration at best, but some English teams lack that pedigree, and it is much harder for them to build it up. Whereas the big hitters in Europe from other countries, whether that be Barca, Bayern, Real Madrid or PSG, tend to qualify for the Champions League every single season, and have done for as long as anyone can care to remember. In the Premier League, the country's Champions League and Europa League representatives are often chopping and changing. Newcastle, for example, may have been hurt by a lack of Champions League pedigree this season, but having built up some minor experience, they are unlikely to build upon that in the immediate future next season, currently 8th in the Premier League table. What makes the Premier League unique in some ways is that Liverpool, for example, won the Champions League during the same season that they finished 5th in the Premier League in 2005, Chelsea won it despite finishing 6th in the league in 2012, and the Blues won it again in 2021, in a season in which they finished 4th, just 1 point above Leicester City. It is unimaginable that that could happen in any other league. It is also illustrative, I think, of the nature of knockout football and cup competitions. The reality is, the so-called best team doesn't necessarily always win. Even if it were the case that by virtue of the league's financial supremacy, Premier League clubs were automatically better than teams from Europe's other major leagues, which, as we've already established, isn't necessarily true, and nor does that financial advantage even exist at the very highest level, but if we were to imagine that it did, it still wouldn't be the case that an English club would win every European trophy every single season. Knockout football is random. The Liverpool team in 2005 wasn't fit to lace the AC Milan team's boots. How can Chelsea possibly have been the best team in Europe when they finished 6th in the Premier League below Alan Pardew's Newcastle? When they won it in 2021, beating Man City in the final, they did so during the same season that they finished a massive 19 points behind Man City in the league. To surmise then, why aren't English clubs more dominant in Europe? Well, basically, they are pretty dominant, though they weren't historically for lots of reasons, a European ban and the hangover from that exile chief among them. They are becoming ever more dominant as the league's financial advantage grows and now the Messi-Ronaldo axis and Barca Madrid's stronghold has ended, and in UEFA's secondary and recently introduced tertiary competitions, now that they're taking them seriously at least, where they have a far greater advantage, and when they don't win, we shouldn't be that surprised because Europe's elite have budgets as big, if not bigger than them, and also knockout football is random and unpredictable, and the best team doesn't always necessarily win, but really, mainly, and this ought not be overlooked, English clubs are pretty dominant. Manchester United were just rubbish in this season's Champions League. Newcastle had a tough group and an injury crisis and also weren't that great, and Arsenal will probably still beat Porto at home and progress despite losing the first leg, and even if they don't, they probably will next time around because they'll most likely only have lost because knockout football is random and unpredictable. I really don't see what is so hard to understand about any of that. Anyway, hopefully the people who asked feel as though I have suitably answered their question. I'm not sure what else there is to say on the matter other than I hope that you all enjoyed it, and I think that I might need my inhaler now. Thank you all very much, as I say, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you did enjoy it. I obviously hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and it goes without saying at this stage, What are you doing if you're not already subscribed and have notifications turned on for both this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my second channel, Alfie Potts Harbour, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads by the username @HITC Sevens on all three, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers!